End-tidal CO2 is one of the most powerful tools that we have in our emergency department. We can use qualitative end-tidal CO2, and we'll just start the video, sir. Thank you. We can use qualitative end-tidal CO2. We use that on a daily basis. You might also be using quantitative end-tidal CO2. But today, I want to talk to you about waveform capnography. This is a way you can look at the physiology of your patients without waiting for lab tests or radiology at the bedside. So end-tidal CO2 has a waveform. The initial waveform is called phase 1. This is the end of inspiration. The first upslope, phase 2, is mostly dead space CO2 and a little bit of alveolar gas. But what we want is this part right here, phase 3, end-tidal CO2, the peak CO2. This is the number we're looking at. And the phase 0, the downslope, is when the first inspiration begins. Now let's compare how end-tidal CO2 compares to venous blood and arterial blood. End-tidal CO2 is always less than those two values because there's always an intrinsic CO2 gap that exists in normal healthy patients. This is about 3 to 5. And as you have more disease, this gap can increase, and this interpretation will help you make interpretations of your patients. There's two ways you can do end-tidal. Side stream capnography, where there's a constant sample of gas going back to the monitor. This always lags behind what's actually happening with the patient, and the pitfall with this is that you can get water vapor and just snot that builds up within the end-tidal monitor and can give you discrepancies with your values. Mainstream capnography is a much better way of doing things. Now the limitation here is you can only do it on intubated patients, but what happens is this is in line with your endotracheal tube, and as CO2 comes in, the infrared sensor detects that CO2 and you get an instantaneous read of CO2 from your patients. And this leads to a couple things. The first thing is that there's no lag time. You get an instantaneous result. You also don't have to worry about the snot and the vapor that builds up in the tubing. It's always accurate. And when you're talking about the waveforms that you get from this, it's much more crisp and accurate than side stream capnography. Now you need 3 things to get end-tidal. You need lungs to blow CO2 out. You need cardiac output to push the CO2 in the blood to the lungs to get them breathing out. And then you need cellular metabolism to make CO2 to get to the heart, to get pushed out, to get out the lungs. But you can look at each one of these things independently. So you can interpret increases in metabolism. Someone who's hyperthermic, someone who's shivering, someone you give a big bicarbolus to, their end-tidal CO2 is going to go up. And you can also look at decreases in metabolism, things like DKA, or a response to a fever response when you give them acetaminophen by looking at the end-tidal CO2. We can also make an assessment of the cardiovascular system, and this is huge. Now, when we're talking about cardiac arrest, we know that this is vital. You know about using end-tidal CO2 during endotracheal tube placement. You know it's recommended for patient transport, but it also helps us with the quality of our compressions. It also might help us to determine the etiology of the person's cardiac arrest. And most importantly, it tells us the prognosis of that patient as we're resuscitating them. Now, what you might not know is you can use this for volume responsiveness. If you have a patient and you give them a passive leg raise and an increase of 5% is noted on your end-tidal CO2, that is synonymous with a patient who's volume responsive, so go ahead and give them fluids. So we talked about metabolism, we talked about the cardiovascular system. Let's talk about one of the biggest uses we use end-tidal CO2 for, and that's the respiratory system. And I want to review some waveforms that might come up that help you with your patients. So the first one is this upsloping, almost shark fin looking appearance. Look how slowly the CO2 rises out to the peak. This is consistent with obstructive diseases, things like COPD and asthma. And as your patient gets better, those waveforms start to square out. This next waveform is a decelerating slope pattern. This is consistent with a reduction in cardiac output, but could also be consistent with hyperventilation. Take a look at the opposite. When you have an increase in your waveform over time, this is consistent with better cardiac output, but when we're talking about the lungs, it's consistent with somebody who's being hypoventilated. So if they're on the vent, you might want to increase their rate. Look at this waveform. This one is tricky. So you have an increasing slope, and you might think that this is somebody who's becoming more hypercarbic from decreased respiratory rate, but the baseline is also increasing here. So it's important to recognize that this is breath stacking or auto-peeping that's happening with this patient. Look at the next waveform. Square waveform on this intubated patient and 2 blips on the screen like that. This is consistent with an air leak. Not all that CO2 is getting out the endotracheal tube. Some is leaking around, and that's why we have that poor waveform. Look at this one. We have that little dip in the top. This is called a curare cleft. This is happening in a patient who's intubated and starts to wake up and takes a breath in during the expiratory phase. They need more sedation. They need more analgesia. Take a look at this waveform. Nice square waveform followed by flat line. This is one of three things. The first thing to think about is just simply the patient is apneic. The second thing is probably there's a problem with the ventilator circuit, or it could be a patient who has cardiac arrest, so you might want to go check a pulse on that person. The last waveform is my favorite, but it's the most benign. This one is called cardiac oscillations. Look at these little blips as you get down to that zero waveform. This is a benign process, and what happens here is the expiration is prolonged, and the heart that's beating underneath is slowly pushing that CO2 out to the detector. So I hope you found this helpful to use end-tidal CO2, not just for ventilations, but for assessing cardiac output and metabolism. End-tidal CO2 is a rapid and non-invasive tool that you can use at the bedside for your critically ill patients. Thank you.